So, welcome back from your intermission. Hope you feel refreshed, got a little coffee, and are ready to continue. Okay, so let's go over segments of the body. Okay, the axial skeleton. Okay, that consists of the head, the neck, and the trunk. It is about 50% of our weight, and it's typically slow moving. Think of how fast you can move your head. It's faster than you can move your neck and your trunk, right? You can only move so fast with your head and neck and your trunk. Okay, but the appendicular skeleton, it's your upper and lower extremities, and those are smaller and faster. So we think of all of our total weight. Look how big of a mass we have at our trunk, right? Versus our arm, small, thin, mobile. Okay, so we have segments of the body, how we kind of break it down. So I took these pictures from Clinical Kinesiology and Anatomy by Lippert. Okay, and you look here, and we have the head. Okay, that consists of just the cranium, so the skull. Okay, we then have the neck, which is your cervical vertebrae, and that's C1 through C7. So we're looking at the base of the skull here and going down to right about our shoulder line here. Okay, we have the trunk, which is two segments. We have the thorax, which is our ribs, our sternum, and our thoracic vertebrae. That's T1 to T12. Now, when I say these C's and T's and L's, that's vertebrae that we are referencing there. The abdomen is the pelvis, the stomach, and the lumbar vertebrae. And then S is your sacrum, which the lumbar vertebrae sit upon. Upper extremities, you have your arm right here. That's your humerus. Okay, then we have your forearm, which is your radius and your ulna, and then your carpal bones, which is in your wrist. And then you have your hand, which is your metacarpals, and then your phalanges, which are like your fingers. Not like, they are your fingers. And you have your lower extremities, so you have your thigh, big meaty part of your leg, and that is your femur that's in there. Your lower leg, which is your tibia and fibula. Tibia is on the inside of your leg, fibula is on the outside. Then you have your foot, which is the carpals, the talus, the calcaneus, the metatarsals, and the phalanges. When we are referencing the body, how we do that is in what we call anatomical position. All the descriptions of movements and locations are based upon this position. So when you're referencing flexion, you're like, is it this way or is it this way? How are my arms? This way, that way? I'm not sure. Go back to anatomical position and that'll answer your question. It is an upright posture. Your eyes are forward. Your feet are parallel within the line of the hips. Your arms are to the side of your body and the palms are facing forward. When we do move, now we have what they call planes of motion, okay? Those are the sagittal plane, the coronal plane, or the frontal, and the transverse plane. So the sagittal plane divides the body into left and right. So what it does is it looks like this. It divides the body into left and right. It does the motions of flexion, extension, plantar flexion, and dorsiflexion. So I'm going to transition here for 1 second. So we have our model right here. We'll call him Frank. And one second. So what happens is that you cut the line straight down the middle and it divides it left and right. But if you think of this line as movable and it can go anywhere on the body. So let's say I move it to my arm here. So what that means is as I rotate this human being here, it would be a box that comes around his body, right? Because that line would go straight through. And it would be like a sheet of glass. So that means if I move my arm up and down like this, or even overhead, anywhere really in this 360 motion, which would be flexion moving forward, and extension going backwards, right? That would be in the sagittal plane. So that would be called in that plane of motion, because if you think of the sheet of glass is flat Anything that's moving along that flat surface would be that. So whether it's in the arm, neck, flexion and extension, hip, flexion and extension, ankle, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, all those motions are happening in this imaginary sagittal plane. Okay? Let's go back to here. Then we have our coronal plane, which is our front and back. Okay, this divides the body into front and back, and those motions are adduction, abduction, and lateral flexion. So now we just imagine that this sheet is now cutting our body into front and back, right? So the frontwards here and the back there, okay? So now we're looking at abduction and adduction, which would be moving sideways like this along the flat sheet of glass. We'll go over it in the lab to really help break this down for you guys, so you guys can actually visually see it as well. And then we have, back to here, the transverse plane, which divides the body into top and bottom. So it'd be like cutting a line straight through our body here, and anything that moves along that sheet of glass. So we're looking more at like rotational when we do that, because it would be a line that comes right here, and now we're rotating left, right, and this part is moving along that flat sheet of glass, if that makes sense. So if I take this here, transverse plane right here, so anything that moves and rotates along that, you see how that works there? And then the sagittal plane here, sorry to try and get even. So if I'm moving up and down, right? So you see how in my shoulder, I'm not holding it this way, right? I'm not the coronal plane, I'm moving it in the sagittal plane, and it's moving flat along this line. Now if I do move it this way, and I want to look at the coronal or frontal plane, now if I go AB and adduction, those are happening in that plane of motion. So now we move on, and we're looking at midline. Midline, if you can see here, there's a yellow line on this PowerPoint slide. And what it does is it cuts the body in half along the sagittal plane, nose to groin. However, as I referenced, the sagittal plane can kind of move, and it's kind of location specific. So if I'm talking about the shoulder can have a sagittal, coronal, transverse plane running through it. But the midline stays right along the middle, and it goes from the top of the head all the way down through your pubic symphysis. Now, there's medial that we use in reference, right? So if I'm saying the medial arm, that means it's the side that's closest to the midline. So that would be the inside of my arm. The lateral would be furthest from the midline. So it would be the outside of my arm, because in reference to my arm, the inside of my arm is closer to the middle of my body than the outside of my arm. Okay? Now I use the elbow as a description there. Okay, I already discussed pretty much that coronal plane and how it divides the body into front and back, from the ear to the lateral femoral head down the side. So when we talk about posture, we're pretty much looking at the coronal plane if we left it centered. What the front of the body is now referenced to, though, moving forward, is anterior. The back of the body is posterior. Okay, so the sternum, an example is the sternum, so the chest bone right here in the middle of your chest, is anterior to the spinal column, which is in the back. Okay? Ventral is a synonym for anterior, and dorsal is a synonym for posterior. Those are often used in relation to the hand and the foot, and the top and the back of the hand are the dorsal, and the bottom of the foot and the palm of the hand are ventral. The trunk is seen as the center point in the body. When we look at that, we also have to reference distance from that. So now when we talk about something being away from the trunk, before it was midline we were referencing, now we're talking about just the proximity to the trunk. If something's distal from that, it is away from the trunk. So my foot is distal within my body and proximal closer to the trunk. My hip is more proximal than my foot, which is more distal to the trunk. Okay? Example, the fingers are distal to the elbow. Okay, my fingers are further from my trunk in relation to my arm segment. My fingers are further than my shoulder, right? So distal, proximal. Okay? The humeral head is located superiorly on the humerus to the lateral epicondyle. we'll go over all this. Our lab activity focuses just on this stuff right here. Okay, so we'll get a good understanding of that as we move forward. And once we get in lab and you're like, ah, okay, now I can see it and I understand. When we're referencing depth, superficial is close to the surface, and if something is deep, it's away from the surfaces. Okay, for example, the scalp is superficial to the skull. Okay, so it sits on top of the hair. The skin on top of our head is superficial to the skull. When referring to the body when lying flat on the ground, so if I was lying on a table or a bed, prone would be the body is positioned with the belly anterior away from the floor. Okay, so I'm lying on my back pretty much. So I apologize. My belly is on the ground. So that's actually wrong. I have that listed wrong. So prone, laying prone on my belly on the ground is how that goes. My belly is close to the ground. Supine is when I'm positioned so that my back is away from the floor, but I apologize. I switched those up. I'm going to fix it right now. So ignore this part here. We'll clarify it in lab. I apologize. Prone, belly down. Belly and floor are touching. Okay. Supine, back and floor are touching. Okay. Think of the belly or your hand. We always learned about it as our hand, right? So the anterior portion here is up, and it's saying more soup, please. Supine. Okay, we'll go over that in lab to clarify. But once again, prone is when my belly and the floor are making contact, or belly and the table are making contact. Supine is when my back and the table are making contact. Okay? I apologize that I wrote it wrong there. Sides of the body. Bilateral. If we're talking about one side versus the other side, if we're talking about both sides, we're talking about bilateral. And when we're performing a bicep curl, ideally you would work bilaterally and work both arms so you don't have one larger arm than the other. Contralateral is the opposite side of the body. So if I'm referencing the left side, I just did the other side. I did my left side, and I'm like, all right, let's work the contralateral side. That means I'm working the other side, the right side in this case. Okay, ipsilateral, same side of the body. So we're going to do an ipsilateral series, and we're going to do left bicep curls with left hip flexions or left leg presses. That's talking about ipsilateral. Okay. Joint osteokinematics. Osteokinematics is the relationship of the movement of bones around an axis. Okay, so all of our bones are levers and fulcrums and whatnot, and we're going to dive into that later. But they all move around an axis or a point or a joint is what we call them. Okay. So we have flexion, which is bringing one bone closer to another. So we have flexion here. Flexion. Bringing it close. Extension is moving it away. So when I straighten my arm, extending. Flexing. Extending. Okay? Then we have abduction, which is moving away from midline. So that is pulling it here. Let me move this out of the way here. So abduction is bringing my arm this way. Okay, adduction, think of adding towards the midline. So ADD, add. So I'm bringing it towards, I'm adding to the midline. Okay, circumduction is moving in a circle like this. Okay, and then degrees of freedom. When we start talking about joints, you'll see that it's talking about how many planes of motion that each joint moves in. An example is the ankle that has 1 degree of freedom. We'll really dive into degrees of freedom when we dive into anatomy and we start diving into the joint specifics, the movements of each joint, and then you'll be like, okay, it's got 2 degrees of freedom. I understand what that means now. Okay, feel free to take another break as you need. I'm gonna have another sip of coffee. Alrighty, if you're not back yet, take your time. Just pause the video, no big deal. So now let's dive into laws of motion. Okay, so we have Newton's 3 laws of motion that affect pretty much everything we're going to do. The first law, the law of inertia. Object in motion stays in motion, and an object at rest stays at rest. Think of a car accelerating or braking. So when I'm driving down the road and I hit the brakes, what happens to our body? It continues to move forward, and I hit the steering wheel, right? Or the seatbelt locks, right? If I accelerate, I'm standing still. Car accelerates. What do? I go back because my body stays backwards until the seat hits it and pushes me forward. Okay, here's a little video here. Let me see if I can get it to work. A quick army ad here. Sorry, guys.
Imagine you're sitting on a recliner chair watching your favorite movie on a lazy Sunday. And your mom calls out your name and asks you to run some errands. You can imagine how difficult it would be for you to get up and do the work. Imagine you're practicing for your 100 meters race on this track, and somebody asks you to stop immediately within a second. Will you be able to do it? What if you're suddenly asked to turn towards the right? Will you be able to turn immediately? The answer to both the questions would be a no. You can stop, yes, but gradually. You can also turn, but not sharply. And guess what? It's the same story with every object. Every object will continue to do what it's doing. If it's at rest, it will remain at rest. And if it's in motion, it will stay in motion. But what can change this? Yes, only an unbalanced force can change this. If it's at rest and an unbalanced force acts on it, it will move. If it's in constant motion and an unbalanced force acts on it, it may accelerate or change direction. And this is nothing but the Newton's first law of motion. Here's the correct definition. An object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion with the same speed and the same direction, unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. In simple words, it means that the objects continue to do what they're doing unless some external unbalanced force acts on them. We can also understand this using a simple diagram. If the forces are balanced, there can be two cases. An object may be at rest, or an object will be in motion at a non-zero constant velocity in a particular direction. These can be the only two cases when the forces are balanced. In the first case, the object will continue to remain at rest, and in the second, the object will continue to stay in motion at the same velocity and in the same direction. Don't forget, these two cases will remain true only if the forces are balanced. In the next video, we will look at a few applications of the first law of motion.
Okay, so that kind of goes over the first law of motion there. Let me go back here. Okay, so the second law, the law of acceleration. The amount of acceleration depends on the force applied to an object. So acceleration is inversely related to the mass of an object. So lighter objects accelerate, have more acceleration than a slower object. So think of a running back versus a lineman, a smaller person, a thrower versus a sprinter, right? The bigger you are, the less you accelerate. The smaller you are, the faster you'll accelerate. So think of a soccer ball versus a bowling ball. So another nice video here. Let's watch that to help clarify it for you guys.
Do you remember the Newton's first law of motion? It says that an object will continue to do what it's doing unless acted upon by an unbalanced force or some net force. Now the important question is, what happens when there is net force acting on an object? That's precisely what the second law of motion will discuss. Do you remember understanding the first law of motion with a simple diagram? If the forces are balanced, the acceleration will be zero. In the first case, the object will continue to remain at rest, and in the second, the object will continue to stay in motion at the same velocity and in the same direction. Don't forget, these two cases will remain true only if the forces are balanced. Only if the net force is zero. Now let's try to create a similar diagram for the second case. If the forces are unbalanced, then there will be acceleration. We saw that in the previous video. And now we come to the interesting part. Let me ask you a question and I'm sure you can answer it. On which two factors do you think the acceleration will depend on? I want you to tax your brain a bit. Let me repeat my question. On which two factors do you think will the acceleration depend on? Okay, let's say there's an object on a table. You apply a net force of 10 units on it. And then you apply a net force of 20 units on it. In which case do you think the acceleration will be more? Of course, the one in which the force was more. So we can say that one of the things the acceleration depends on is net force. If it's more, then more will be the acceleration. If it's less, then lesser will be the acceleration. Acceleration depends directly on the net force. Come on, now I want you to think about the second quantity the acceleration will depend on. Let's say there are two objects on the table. One has a mass of 3 kilograms and the other has a mass of 5 kilograms. Now, if you apply net force of 10 units to each of them, which one do you think will accelerate more? Surely it's the 3 kg one because it has lesser mass. Lesser the mass, more the acceleration. And more the mass, lesser the acceleration. Hence we can say that acceleration depends inversely on the object's mass. If you understand this concept well, then understanding the second law of motion will be very easy. Mathematically, it can be written like this. In simple terms, the acceleration is directly proportional to the net force applied and inversely proportional to the mass of the object. That's the second law. Or as more people understand it, like this. The net force is the product of mass and acceleration. With this, can you tell me the units of force? That should be easy. The standard unit of mass is kilograms, and that of acceleration is meters per second squared. So the unit of force is kilograms times meters per second squared. And this is what we call as Newton. 1 Newton is 1 kilogram times meters per second squared. So if the mass of the object is 10 kilograms and the acceleration is 10 meters per second squared, then the force will equal 100 newtons. We can say that 1 Newton is defined as the amount of force required to give a 1 kilogram mass and acceleration of 1 meter per second squared.
Okay, and then we have the third law of action and reaction. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Ground force is a good idea, or a good demonstration of this. And it's the force of the ground pushing back on you as you walk or jump. So as you are moving, you push down on the ground pushes up on you. Sand has less ground reaction force, right? So you have less because what happens is you push into the ground doesn't push up as much as you. So different objects have different masses which have different ground reaction forces that are created. So if it had no ground reaction force, then you would just sink right through. Okay, so that's kind of what that's talking about. Let's watch one more video here.
Don't overpay for Best Buy. Wikibuy can save you money. It's a browser extension.
The only question you need to ask yourself while studying the third law is, what happens when two objects interact with each other? What happens when you place an object on the table? The object exerts a force on the table and the subject exerts an upward force on the object. There are two forces that result from this interaction, a force on the table and a force on the object. The magnitudes of the two forces are the same, but the directions are opposite. These forces are called as action and reaction forces. The force exerted by the object on the table was an action force, and the force exerted by the table on the object is the reaction force. What we saw here is nothing but a display of the Newton's third law of motion. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
Okay, so here we are with our whiteboard. And so if I have a force, right? So what we're talking about is torque. So we'll draw a little wrench. Right there. It's a beautiful wrench, I know. So torque is all about applying force from this object here into this one focal point. Okay, so I can increase this two ways, right? One, I have more force here. Increase X, we'll say. So the force, so if I had 10 newtons of force I was applying with, now I need to increase it to, let's say 15, and then I can apply more force to this point. Okay, so that's one way. And then two is a longer arm. Okay, so we could take this, and instead of applying more force, let's say my arms are only, I can only produce so much force through my arms, right? So my arm is only so strong. So I can use leverage to increase that and increase the torque. And we'll learn how this really affects it when we get into the kinematics. And you'll be like, oh, that's why a longer lever arm is actually applies more force onto here. So I can actually use less force up here. So instead of 10 newtons, I might be able to use 8 newtons. But because I increased the lever arm, I'm applying enough, that 15 down here, that it requires to move the bolt. Okay. In the body, the amount of torque depends on the strength of a muscle or force and its distance from the lines of pull. So torque is greatest when the angle of pull is at 90 degrees. It decreases as the angle of pull decreases. Okay, so no torque is produced when force is directed exactly through the axis of rotation. So there's no torque. So it doesn't torque. So like when you're hyperextended and your arm's out and someone catches you and you grab something and it pulls it back, a lot of torque happens and you feel that in your elbow, even though you caught them with your hand, right? Or you caught them, they may have hit the wrist, but you feel it in your elbow because it's applying that torque through this lever arm. Sorry, I realize you can't see. So it hits you here, all that force, this is our big wrench handle now, right? And it applies all that force into my elbow joint and I feel that and I torque it like that. So I get a lot of pain in my elbow, or I get a pain because all that force happened in there. Now when no torque is produced, so let's say I'm at 90 degrees, right? And torque is the greatest when the angle pulls at 90. So if I was here and then down here, right? So if my arm's at 90 degrees here, the angle of torque would be the most when I open it up. And that's where most of that torque happens. Okay, as I decrease my angle of pull, there's less torque on my elbow. Does that make sense there? And it says no torque is produced when it's directed exactly through the axis. So if I'm out here, that torque's not happening through the axis, right? If I'm hitting it with an angle here, my force comes in and it hits it along this way here, right? It hits in that sagittal plane, the force does. Along that coronal plane, it's in that 90 degrees, and that force isn't going straight through here. It's coming here and then being redirected. But if I can hit it here at this 90 degrees and hit there into my elbow, there's nothing. There's very little torque on that elbow because the force goes straight into the joint. Perpendicular force. When a muscle has a perpendicular distance, a muscle creates a stabilizing force. All force generated goes directly back into the joint. Okay, so that 90 degrees. That's why when you're holding something, we typically hold an object like this, right? Because it's the easiest for us to do. When we're pushing, it's here, along here. That's why they say like the bench press and things like that, keeping your arms at 90 degrees, because that decreases torque into the joint. The angular force is where most of the force created by a muscle is directed at rotating. So it's made it comes at a rotation, and it's worried about causing this rotation. That's what it tries to do. So as we dive into more of the anatomy of each muscle, you'll understand, and you're like, okay, that muscle is aligned how it is because it's trying to create a rotation within, like the pronator and supinator of my elbow runs like that, right? So it's not directing the force right into the joint. What it is doing is working on pronating and supinating my wrist like this, right? As it contracts, it's going to pull it that way, and as it relaxes, it goes that way. Okay, so it's applying an angular force that is focused at directing a rotational force within the joint, and then the dislocating force. When the force is applied past 90 degrees, the force is directed away from the joint. So that would be that dislocating hyperextended elbow type force that dislocates, and because the force is directed away from the joint and not the strongest point, which is the joint. Okay. When all torque in the body is equal, we are in equilibrium. Gravitational force is always pulling us towards zero, so we always have this pull down towards the ground. Okay. In the body, when equilibrium is maintained, this is known as having a perfect center of gravity. The center of gravity is located in midline, slightly anterior to the second sacral vertebrae. So right around between our belly button and our pubic symphysis. In a child, the center of gravity is slightly higher, just because they don't have as much mass in their legs yet. So most of their mass is taller in their upper body. And just like with women, their center of gravity is a little bit higher as well because of the breast tissue. So when we're looking at stability, we're looking at the line of gravity, and it should pass vertically through the center of gravity and our base of support. When this happens, we are in equilibrium. You see how it's perfectly straight through, center of gravity, and our base of support. Our base of support is created by our feet. Okay? That's why when we need to be more stable, we usually spread our feet out. Spread our feet out creates a larger base of support and makes us a little bit more stable when we're dealing with a force that's going to try and knock us off that center of gravity. So there's three states of this equilibrium. One is when you're stable. The object is stable and it would need the center of gravity to be raised to become unstable. You're like a brick. Okay. Unstable is when only a slight force is needed to disturb the object. So like a single leg balance. I'm still stable, but if I get out of whack or I come and push you, it throws you off balance. And then neutral is when the center of gravity is neither raised nor lowered, and it's like a ball. A ball just rolls because the center of gravity stays in the center and it just rolls. The lower center of gravity, the increased stability. So that's why I like getting in a good athletic position when we're talking about doing agility drills and things like that. As you lower your butt and lower your center of gravity, you become more stable and you can create more power and drive that into the force, creating more ground reaction force, thus being more powerful, more explosive. So center of gravity and line of gravity need to pass through the base of support to maintain that stability. Like I said, straight down through. You increase that base of support, you increase the stability, and then the greater the mass, the greater the stability. So as my mass increases, I have also a greater stability. And the greater the friction between the base of support and the support equals greater stability. So if I'm in socks on a wood floor versus if I'm in rubber shoes, I increase my friction between my base of support and the support, which would be the ground. I have a greater stability. So then some basic physics of kinesiology and biomechanics. We have statics, which deal with non-moving or nearly non-moving systems. Dynamics, which is most of us dealing with sports and things like that. We're dealing with moving systems. Statics would be more along the line of your basic rehabilitation type things. But if we're looking at coaching, strength training, things like that, we're looking at dynamics. We're looking at kinetics, the force that causes the movement, or kinematics, the movement created by the force. So kinetics looks at the force, kinematics looks at the effect. The force is a push or pull action. A vector has both magnitude and direction. So it tells us how big, either how long, how the area, the volume, the mass, and where it's going. So like kicking a ball has both force and direction. I'm kicking it towards the goal. And then we have velocity, which is a vector that describes speed only. A mass is a quantity of matter a unit contains, right? So think of it as filling up a cup, right? If I fill a cup with sand, it's got a lot of matter in it. The more sand I can put in there, the more mass I'm able to create. Inertia is the resistance of matter to change its motion. Torque is a tendency of a force to produce rotation around an axis. And friction prevents motion of one surface on another. So that's all we have for our class presentation today. Nice 35-minute presentation. If those videos don't work with the sound, just let me know and I will post the links and we can look at it from there. Otherwise, for lab, we're going to go over this and have a good time. Okay? If you guys have any questions, use the discussion board, reach out to me. If you have a question about your lab assignment, also reach out and contact me. All right? Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.